So the, the next speaker, who is our keynote, who, similar to Margaret, uh, traveled home from his family vacation yesterday. He lives in Portland. He flew up this morning and was picked up this morning at about 9 o'clock at our airport. So he's gone out of his way here to be here today. And Clark Brockman is a friend of mine. We've been serving on the board of Cascadia. I've been there for 4 years. He's been there for forever, I think. But but I think as we were a couple years ago thinking that our Pacific Northwest is doing some great things, and the Cascadia Green Building Council is Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. And so we started discussions about how we could share, what we're doing, the Living Building Challenge, the Living City Initiative, and things like that outside of this area. And that's where this whole idea and what was born out of that was the International Living Future Institute, which I'm sure Clark is going to highlight that too. So great things are happening in our region, and I'm sure Clark will highlight many of those. But a little bio on Clark. He's an architect. He's a principal director of sustainability of Sierra Architects in Portland. He's their principal dedicated to sustainability and is a champion for energy efficient, climate responsive design throughout the built environment. Since joining Sierra in 2002, Clark has helped his colleagues embed sustainability practices into all aspects of the firm. As co-founder of Sierra's Sustainability Resources Group, Clark is a passionate advocate and facilitator who has led the firm's continuing evolution in the fast-growing arena of high-performance buildings and district-scale systems. He is a past chair of Cascadia Region Green Building Council and a founding and current board member of the International Living Future Institute. So please welcome Clark.
Well, thanks so much for having me here today. It's great. I would say, as you'll see in this presentation, I consider myself more of a recovering architect these days, but I'm not sure I could have been set up better than what Margaret just did about the Living Building Challenge, because that's also what we've been working on. But I will have a few slides about buildings today, only at the beginning, and then the rest will be about district systems. But I think much of what Margaret teed up has huge implications for our neighborhoods and our cities. And it all comes down to this, especially for the architects and the engineers, but actually for everyone that Mark had hands raised in the room. Actual performance is where things are going. It's all about those pesky things inside buildings, which are people. They really are the ones that use energy. I think we forget this. I think we sometimes forget even why we create the built environment, and we create the built environment on behalf of people. And in theory, we should be also something for people, but we have forgotten we're part of nature too. So there's a thing, but we really want to focus on this because to date, this isn't the way our codes are built. This isn't the way we're taught to design. We're not an outcome-based society yet. And yet this is actually what net zero performance and actual performance is. The Living Building Challenge is an outcome-based green building standard. You don't even get to submit until you've demonstrated the building's actually performing the way you want it to. I want to make sure that the contractors, owners, engineers, and architects in the room are thinking about what will it mean 1 or 2 or 3 code cycles from now when the building codes are requiring us to demonstrate actual performance of our buildings. That's where we're going. The draft codes are already written. I was just in DC a couple weeks ago working on a policy summit about how to make this happen. I want to make sure people leave here today realizing this is not a fanciful thing. Outcome-based codes is where things are going. If you wanted a sense of that, you can just look at the 5 cities now, but this slide is now out of date. I think there's actually 10 cities that have outcome-based reporting requirements. So they're actually asking people to start to report how much energy buildings are using. And you've got to know that if you're starting to report how much energy your building's using, that's just the precursor to all of this other work. I think it's very exciting. I think it's actually really important that we, as the built environment profession, deliver buildings that actually perform the way we told the client they would. And that's just not the way codes work right now. There are systems out there. The one on the left is the European system about reporting building energy use. The one in the middle is NREL's ZEPI scale. And the one on the right is ASHRAE's proposal, which I'm not going to give them a big grade for creativity, but it does look an awful lot like the European one. We will be, I mean, these things are coming, and again, we're already starting to use them in those 5 cities and now maybe 10 cities. So I'm only going to briefly talk about our living building project because Margaret did such a good job of teeing things up, but there are some things we learned here that actually have real district scale and city scale implications. This is the living building project our firm's been working on in Portland for the last 4 years, which, unlike the Bullitt Center, is not going to be built. We found out it's through political chaos in Portland, it's officially dead. But that doesn't mean we didn't learn a lot working on it. And one of the interesting things, and Margaret definitely touched on this, is the notion of dashboards. But what we're envisioning, and it really moves to district scale, is the notion of fractal dashboards. We're going to need dashboards that are at city scale. So if you're driving by the building or you're on the web, anyone can go find out how the buildings are doing against their goals. But we're also going to have, as you walk into these buildings, you're going to want to know a lot more. And we're actually hoping to engage you a lot more. And this will be true at the Bullitt Center, where the building lobby will be a host of information for people. But then when you get, remember, one of the key things Margaret talked about was the tenants have an energy budget and a water budget. Imagine what that lease looks like for a second. Think about that. And so you're going to want to walk into work and say, how are we doing? And we're even imagining cap and trade schemes, right? Where some firms are going to be ahead of their goals and some are going to be behind. We're going to need some sort of trading mechanism within these buildings or within these districts, hold that thought, to get ourselves to our goals. And then ultimately, we've got to get people engaged personally. So the technology exists to do all of this. It just hasn't all been put together in a tidy way inside one building before. So we're all owe a debt of gratitude to the Bullitt Foundation and Miller Hall and PAE for the work that they're doing. It is really, really groundbreaking. So now let's move to district. So the notion of an outcome-based district already exists. It exists right down in Seattle at the 2030 district. Some people think it's such a good idea that there are now 3 or 4 of these 2030 districts cropping up around the country. And it's a whole group of businesses that are banding together and setting goals. The 2030 district wants to be 50% less carbon, less energy use by the year 2050. Is that right? I believe. And they've already got a website reporting how they're actually doing. So again, I just want to make sure everyone's aware, because I don't think the AIA is telling us this. I don't think the code people are telling us this, that we're actually heading to this outcome-based world. So just use that as a framework for the rest of my talk. So now I want to talk about high-performance neighborhoods, sometimes called eco-districts. We use those phrases interchangeably. I think it's really important to note that there's a lot of growing focus on our cities just in the last couple of years. The population in urban areas in America is now larger than the population in rural areas, and that hasn't been true since 1910. So it's a big, important trend. And it's all about scale and resource flows. You're going to hear me talk about this over and over today. And regional components, getting a regional mentality, regional economies. There's a whole bunch of issues around regional economies that'll tie to this, but it's still going to have a big global impact. So I'm first going to do a review of some so-called eco-districts or high-performance neighborhoods that already exist. Unfortunately, all of the ones I'm going to show are outside the United States. But that's just the way things are. We're really close to starting to get some. This is Malmo, Sweden. Pretty famous for a brand new district that has all sorts of interesting things going on. I think some of the things that are quite interesting about district scale is that we're going to start to celebrate things we've been hiding for a long time. I actually got to speak at the Civil Engineering School at University of Washington earlier this year, and I was trying to convince both the faculty and the students that infrastructure is going to become sexy. Mark my words, you heard it here. It's true. And it already is. We just forgot about it, right? We've been so busy trying to hide things and make things go away that we aren't celebrating things that are actually part of our place. And so energy and water infrastructures are going to become more visible. We're going to get back to creating neighborhoods that really feel like they're human scale. We're going to get a lot better at mobility and mixed modal things, so it isn't all a car culture. This is already happening. And I was just reading an article on the way up today in Architectural Record about Oklahoma City. Oklahoma City is completely reinventing their downtown transportation system. They're taking out all the one-way streets and turning them into two-way streets. They're doing a bunch of things, just a whole number of issues around this. We're going to be remaking the urban, but we're also going to be remaking suburban infrastructure. So I think the remaking of suburbia is a huge job opportunity for a lot of people in the room, and just pay attention to that. So let's also now go to Stockholm. Stockholm has Hammarby's Jostad, and I've actually gotten to tour both of these places. Very interesting. This is much older. This has been there about 11 years. Now it's a very vibrant neighborhood, very, very successful. This is their flow map of all of the resources in and out of their community. And I think this is something we're going to see more and more of. What we want to do is start to close loops. If you think about most of our systems right now, they're one way in, one way out, whether you're talking about energy, water, or waste. If you were to draw the flow map for most cities right now, it's just lines on the left of resources in, and then lines on the left as waste resources out. And we're going to start closing all these loops. In fact, I think there are even discussions of things like that here in Bellingham. But still getting this mouse figured out. So one of the things they've done in Hammarby is close the waste system. So they actually have a vacuum waste system that exists as infrastructure underneath the entire community. And these are for different things, glass, plastics, organics, and I think so-called waste, then whatever, the last bit that's left over. But it's all getting vacuum tubed to a central location, as you can see here. I think we're still some years away in America from getting to this level of infrastructure, even though I am working on a project in the United States where we may be doing vacuum organics only. It's a much smaller system. It's a much easier infrastructure to install, and there's a lot of real easy upside benefits that come out of that. But in Europe, it's not quite commonplace, but it's in many, many cities. So one of the things it gets you to do is it allows you to really start to optimize waste to energy systems. And this is a waste to energy plant just outside Stockholm. And when I say just outside, I mean like 2 miles outside downtown Stockholm. This has not been pushed out to the periphery. It's not been hidden away like so many of our energy plants. It's right basically in downtown. It's a very pristine place. Here I want to draw your attention because it's an interesting kind of big diagram until you see the size of a big semi-truck. This is a really big system. This is what it looks like to be that operator that's feeding the fire, as it were. But that's how they're making their energy, and it's how they're making their electricity, and it's how they're dealing with their waste. And we could have a really robust discussion about whether we like that or not, but it is working for them, and their carbon neutrality numbers are some of the lowest in the world. Stockholm's either number 1 or number 2 in the whole world for lowest carbon footprint in cities. A little closer to home, Dockside Green over in Victoria. Very nice development, smaller in scale, but has a lot of similar characteristics. It's one of the most beautiful, meaningful rain gardens I've seen, at least up in the Pacific Northwest, where all the rain is being captured on the roof, and then it's become this huge amenity to the ground floor tenants. And their district energy plant is literally in the neighborhood. It is in Dockside Green. And they've got a biomass gasification plant that is within sight of all of the units. So doing cogeneration. And for people in the audience who may not know what that is, cogeneration is the burning of something. Lots of different things can be burned for heat, which then turns turbines that make electricity, and the waste heat that comes off of that can then be transferred into any variety of heating systems, whether it's steam, but much more these days it's low temperature hot water. Here's how their systems work. They're using wood chips from the region, something a lot of us are plentiful here in the Pacific Northwest. They've got a very public display about this. Everyone in the community understands how the system works. They actually understand where their energy comes from, which is, again, something else we've lost. And now I'm going to shift from city scale or big neighborhood scale down to campuses. Universities, I think, are actually going to be a real proving ground. I believe there's some Western Washington folks in the audience here. And I think this will be true for a lot of universities. They're going to be a proving ground partly out of necessity with some real big deferred maintenance costs around very old infrastructure, but also because they, unlike cities and neighborhoods, control all of their land. They even usually control their streets. So they have a lot more flexibility to reinvent their infrastructure quickly when it makes sense for them to do than cities would have a little more complexity in cutting those deals. So one of the interesting things, and we've seen it in university work, but this is absolutely analogous back into cities, is that if we start to co-locate residential next to either classrooms or offices, these two uses, residential versus classroom or office, peak at almost exactly opposite times, both in terms of energy and water. And this is really interesting. It has huge implications for zoning, both for campuses and for cities, because we've been in the habit, even very recently, of segregating a bunch of housing in one place and all the offices somewhere else, even though everyone, especially these days, is thinking that mixed-use living, live-work, is really where we want to go. We've been segregating these systems. If we start to integrate them again, we're going to find a lot of efficiencies come in energy and water. A great specific case in point in this is we did an analysis for the University of Washington and found that one dorm, about 300 beds, doing one shower cycle for one morning, fills a relatively small tank, especially if you compare it to the size of the tanks the living buildings have been doing, maybe a 5 or a 10,000 gallon tank. That will flush toilets for 5 different classroom buildings in one day. It's a very closed loop system, very integrated, very low cost infrastructure as long as they're close to each other. As soon as they're not close to each other, it's not going to make any sense to do. Same things are happening in energy. They're peaking in energy different times. So another university that's getting into this in a big way is Stanford. Stanford's doing it on the energy side. They have, like many, many universities have, they have a legacy steam system in tunnels throughout the campus. Easy to maintain because everything's centralized, but very, very inefficient. And so they're changing to a low temperature system, shifting down to, and when I say low temperature, we're moving into 120 to 160 degrees, but it's actually hot water. And low temperature cooling, instead of right at 40 degrees, it might be more like 60 degrees. And so they're shifting from cold chilled water and hot steam to low temperature hot water and not very cold water. Huge implications for them. Here, this is an interesting graph. The light blue band and the yellow band across the middle, these are hours across the whole year, so the year is from left to right, January to December. Those represent times when buildings on campus were calling for both heating and cooling at the same time. This is actually how most buildings in the entire country work right now. Any buildings with VAV boxes and reheat coils, people are turning the thermostats up or down. They're not quite, the machines now are not quite sure what to do, so they're pulling in really cool air and then they're reheating that air that we spent energy cooling using hot water or other systems to get it to be just the right temperature we want because we want to be 72 degrees all the time. There's a tremendous amount of inefficiency here, or if you're an engineer, a lot of low-hanging fruit, right? It's a big project. They have 7 phases. This stretches out over a 20-year thing, but they're in the middle of phase 1 right now. It's a big shift. But these numbers, and we won't get into all the intricacies of this graph, but suffice it to say that the dark black line is business as usual energy use and energy costs, I would point out. And this is what's happening as they institute the new system. The big number here is $639 million savings over business as usual. Not to mention, they're going to meet and eventually break their carbon targets as well. And they're part of the President's Challenge, as most universities are, about trying to get to carbon neutral campuses. And this was one of the biggest moves they could make. So if there's only a couple things you take away from my talk today, I would like them to be these, which is, as a long-time green building architect, I am now a recovering architect. Because when you start to work at district systems, you find some really interesting things. So the first is that for the last 15 years, I've spent a tremendous amount of energy and brain damage trying to optimize energy, water, and waste system flows within the arbitrary boundaries of a building. Only to find that energy, water, and waste all optimize at a scale bigger than a building. So hold on to that thought. The second one is, as soon as you start to think about that, the first thing we wanted to do in the Portland Eco District movement was go find a few blocks, get some like-minded owners, draw a boundary around those blocks, and then declare victory and say we're going to go forth and make them net zero. But I can tell you that energy, water, and waste don't optimize at the same scale. So if energy, water, and waste all optimize at a scale bigger than a building, and none of them optimize at the same scale, life just got really interesting. Now you can do it at the scale of a building, as the Bullet Center proves, and it's really, really important that we get some living buildings showing that. It's going to be a lot easier to have living buildings when we start connecting them to district systems. So it's really important that we prove up these cases, but then it's going to be a lot more important that we start realizing that these systems optimize at bigger scales. So this is just a 4-graph series that we had done kind of as a thought experiment with Arup. And it's been really interesting work. I have to stress, because these slides will be made available, these slides don't represent the truth. They are not empirical. They are not mathematical. These are gut instincts from a bunch of professionals thinking about it. Any district scale job I do now going forward, I will go through this thought experiment because it's completely place-based. And it will change based on the climate, based on the cost of energy, based on the energy mix available to you in other systems. But what you want to do is start asking yourselves, at what scale do these different systems optimize? And for example, for the project we were working on, anaerobic digestion, where you're taking organics, turning into synthetic gas, and then using that biogas to do cogen, doesn't even begin to optimize until block or campus scale. But once you start that system and once you've invested in that system, it is very likely to deliver more and more positive returns up to the scale of a city or even maybe a region. So that's just one example. If we go to other energy systems, it's really interesting to see how many systems don't even begin to make sense until you get to building or even block scale. Campus, things really start to hum, but once you get bigger than a campus, many of the systems drop off precipitously in terms of their efficiency. Some of this has to do with infrastructure costs and a variety of things, but again, it varies. This was done for a very specific project. It's the thinking in these slides that I want you to worry about, not the actual apparent answers. And then here's water systems with gray water and reclaimed water really looking good if you again get to that campus scale or bigger. And that's what it looks like. We finally call this the spaghetti diagram. There's not a lot you can glean from this, except maybe you start to look at this campus zone and go, something's going on at that small neighborhood, district, campus scale that's pretty interesting. So many of you probably know that Portland's been involved in an eco-district initiative over the last 5 years. I've been co-chair of the technical advisory committee and involved with that. Bellingham, they held a Eco-Districts Institute that was an intensive for 10 or 11 cities that were selected this year in the spring, and Bellingham was a participant. Portland, Guadalajara, Mexico, Mountain View, California, Philadelphia, a variety of cities came in for 3 days. Cities and private entities worked on ways to really get eco-districts going. So that's a big part of what POSI's doing. We've got 5 pilots in Portland. If you know Portland at all, these are 5 very different neighborhoods by design. They were selected because they're so different. Everything from south of Market, which is the kind of new hip name for the university district at Portland State University. But it's intentionally, they wanted to rename it that way because they wanted to make sure that it wasn't just about the university. It was about the university being part of downtown Portland. South Waterfront is the new Point Tower, New development, actually reminiscent of Vancouver, BC in a lot of ways. Lloyd Center is an established business district with a bunch of surface parking. Really kind of a classic, what I'd call American downtown business district. And then Gateway and Foster Green are both depressed residential areas, lots of single family homes. Foster Green, I think, has over 80 languages spoken in their schools, just 5 miles from downtown Portland. So very, very different. What does an eco-district mean to each of these places? Well, it's probably not surprising. It means something different to every single one. Posey's worked really hard over the last years to create a toolkit. You can download this. And again, the slides will be made available, so you don't need to try and copy down these long URLs that'll be on my slides. Big thing to take away from this slide is there's hardware projects. Think of buildings, streets, infrastructure, pipes. And there's software projects, social systems, people, natural systems. Right now, the tendency in the world of eco-districts is to keep knee-jerking to the left and worrying about hardware projects. It's a lot easier to figure out what the return on investment on a district energy system is than there is on a new pedestrian way. But I think what we really want to do is not forget the software side, and if anything, re-emphasize it, overemphasize it, and keep emphasizing it, because the hardware stuff will come. If we get the social systems right, hardware, we will build the hardware we need, but if we build the hardware first, we're going to need to really be careful about what happens. So just think about that. So for the rest of the day today, when I talk about hardware and software, I'm thinking infrastructure, buildings versus people systems. We got to do the first district assessment, and this is of the Foster Green and Gateway districts in Portland, and did lots of interesting analyses. These are only 6 maps we created, but we mapped all sorts of interesting things. But one of the ones that really was interesting to us is the block size analysis. The blocks in Foster Green are huge by most city standards, but in Portland standards, they're enormous, because Portland, if any of you have been there, have really small blocks, 200 foot on a side, makes it very walkable, really changes the whole character of that city. And just 5 miles away in Gateway, they've got blocks that are 300, 400, even 600 feet on an edge, and they're wondering why they can't get robust, walkable communities and development to happen. So one of the first things to do is the remaking of suburbia. That's where this gets filed. A lot of interesting work in here in these maps. In fact, PSU, who's a big partner in the eco-district effort, has mapped things like benzene levels across the entire city. And not surprisingly, they're really high near the freeways. But if you start looking at which neighborhoods are next to those freeways, there's some inequity there that's pretty obvious when you start to map where is the city toxic, more toxic and less toxic. So just a couple slides on civic ecology. This is a construct that we've come up with at Sarah, but anyone can do it. This is just a name we've created, but it's really about community scale mapping of what is your community decide that it needs and want to make happen in your community. It's a bottom-up approach. The whole notion is that civic is something that we think we may have been forgetting about in our society. And if you go back to the original notion around outcome-based buildings and outcome-based communities, that we need to get people involved. We need to get people to become participant in their environments again. Right now we have such a passive contract. Every building we walk into, including this one, we just expect it to be a certain temperature. And we don't ask the building what it wants of us, and there's absolutely no discussion. That's true in most built environment communities as well. We really want to get out of that, and we want to create a new sense of civic engagement. And also ecology. It's interesting, I think these are things that we kind of know intuitively, but we've forgotten. Our economic system is a wholly owned subsidiary of our own social systems and our human construct, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the natural systems, right? And this is the way things actually work. We just don't like to talk about it. And the way our economics are built right now, our economic models all say it's the other way, and they externalize all these other things. So we're going to have to get back to understanding that both we're civic participants in society and that we are a subset of the natural systems for all of this to work. The other thing about the way we think communities are going to evolve. Is we've always been learning communities, but we've recently, especially in the era of cheap energy since the 50s, we've really, again, through all these passive contracts in our built environment, we've stopped imagining learning environments. And things are going to constantly improve and constantly change, and we should probably start designing them to work that way so that we're much more nimble as we get more and more constrained. So when we do civic ecology exercises, we get community members to map their system flows, just like that Hammersby map that I showed earlier. It's really interesting. You can get any citizen in any community to walk in a room and sit down at a table and do this in an hour. They know where their energy comes from. They know where their waste goes. They know where their water comes from. They know kind of where the economic flows are in their community. You just need to ask them. It's really, really interesting exercise. And if you want to learn more about it, there's actually a book that's been written by PSU, and my partner Tim Smith has written it. But all of this is tied to that soft system side. We're really going to be wanting to work the soft systems at the same time that we're developing new infrastructure. But now we're going to go to infrastructure. So a couple thought experiments, and then my talk will be done. The first one, I got to work on a small team doing infrastructure master planning for University of Washington. And we were given more free rein than usual, and we really were asked, what should the UW be thinking about if we're 30 or 40 years out and we want to meet or exceed the president's climate commitment? We want to get to net zero carbon. And so we started looking at that. One of the interesting things for them is they have this amazing location right there on the lake that's already abuts a bunch of beautiful wetlands. Well, it turns out constructed wetlands are really, really high quality, low energy wastewater treatment systems if you only want to use them that way. And they've got a robust research university that's actually doing a lot of work in public health and a lot of work also in the biosciences, and a really, really strong engineering school. So if you start to put those together and you follow this new trend of universities going multidisciplinary and cross-disciplinary, you could start to have those colleges collaborate on a system that treats water, reclaims that water, creates a purple water or a reclaimed water district that's then used within the campus. They're expanding to this area west of 15th rapidly. And they were actually, as we did this experiment, they were in the process of, in final construction docs on 5 dorm buildings. Chris, is that right? And they were all going for green building standards. I think LEED Gold might have been their target. But they hadn't thought about this system. And that earlier slide I showed of housing next to classrooms, huge synergies around reclaimed water use and gray water use. So they actually stopped the dorm projects, held a one-day charrette, brought in all the different design teams who were really open and willing to participate, and then got gray water systems put into that project because it looked like you can't add purple pipe or reclaimed water systems into a building cost effectively after you've done it. So Chris Webb, who's in the audience, participated in that. It was great fun. But you can also start to see that a wastewater system creates organic solids, which we could also link to yard debris and other organic waste, because all of our communities now in the Northwest do curbside organics collection, which you could then, through organic biodigestion or something like that, take to their existing cogen plant. Right now they just have a gas cogen plant. And you could create biogas, which creates dollars, which creates energy, and start to close this loop. But all of these systems, some of them only kind of optimize at campus scale. Some actually are quite good at campus scale. But we were thinking the big advantage to this whole piece is that if they can prove these systems up and demonstrate meaningful ROIs, really find out where all the kinks in the system are, they could take these technologies that they develop, hand it back over to the city of Seattle, and really take some of these systems to scale. It's a very place-based solution. It's going to look different in different cities with different infrastructures, but this is interesting. So now if we move to closer to my neck of the woods in Portland, couple things. These are the urban growth boundaries. I think all of you probably know that Portland's got a really aggressive urban growth boundary. It's largely the reason why Portland has so many of the things we take for granted now, like the robust transit system and the strong green building community. So if we zoom in on that, that's the urban growth boundary. That's the city limits of Portland. Just to give you a sense, and then there's Mount Hood over here to the right. Here are all the watersheds. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Bill Reed of Regenesis, but he's famous for saying that the first meaningful metric size, if you're doing a sustainability analysis, is a watershed. The watershed is the first size at which we can start to analyze systems in a meaningful way. And I find it very interesting. So these are the watersheds that are going into the Willamette and the Columbia and the Portland region. What's interesting is if you were to go to any person on the street in Portland and ask them where their water comes from, they would say the Bull Run watershed. It's the only watershed they know about. It's the only one that they even know the name of. And it's not even really a watershed. It's a human construct with 2 dams. That's part of one smaller watershed. So this is how the Bull Run works. These 2 dams are quite high up. And what's interesting about that is that it means that we've got gravity-fed, pristine water. Very similar to New York's system as well in a lot of Pacific Northwest communities. But most everywhere else in America does not have this. I just spent 9 days in New Orleans, which is pulling water out of the Mississippi right at New Orleans, the base of a third of America's population and farmland is all dumping into the Mississippi. And New Orleans pulls it out, treats it, drinks it, poops in it, pees in it, and then puts it back in the river one more time before it goes in the Gulf. So this is a really excellent water system. I'm not a big fan of dams, but they're there now. What's interesting about how it is, because we've got such elevational gain, is that we can gravity feed it into cisterns that are actually on hills inside Portland. And then those are gravity feeding the potable water system within Portland. So this is a very low energy. This is very resilient. It has great long-term capability if we don't keep wasting our water. This is a map of all the other cities that buy water from Bull Run, which I think is interesting. If water becomes as valuable as I think many of us in the room think it will become, this is going to get really complicated because Portland owns the entire system. Portland sells it for a profit to these other cities. There's a hydrological equity question here that is staring us in the face. In some communities, we actually have a civil engineer on staff in our office, our architectural office, and he lives out in Sherwood. And Sherwood is already rebuilding their infrastructure to try and get access to other fresh water because they're not convinced they will have long-term access to Bull Run. So here's a zoom in on Portland's water system. Here are the 2 reservoirs. This is up in Washington Park, and this is on Mount Tabor, our active volcano. I don't know how many of you know, but Portland is an active volcano within the city limits. True story. We also have a well field. Again, I think a lot of people in town actually know we have a well field. Not very many people know that it's less than 5% of our actual water use. So that Bull Run system really is our water system. And then this is our so-called big pipe. This is our sanitary sewer main system that has been getting developed in very robust ways over the last 10 years. And the rest of my slides are a little commentary on our big pipe. Because I think they have huge implications to all of our cities. We live in the Northwest. We think we're water abundant. We don't talk about these issues very much. Mark's going to like this. And so the way these systems work is all of our surface stormwater is going into gutters. You've all seen it. Those gutters all feed into sanitary sewer, which all go into these pipes. And up until 2000, those pipes were overflowing on any major storm, and we were getting combined sewer overflow or CSO events in Portland. And so that's the EPA actually made us build the big pipe. So here, this is interesting. 13 miles of pipes, 20 years to complete, $1.4 billion. And all of this feeds to one waste treatment plant, which treats water to some legal level and returns it back into the river. Remember again this whole notion of single use. And we take all our organic solids, high value organic solids, and truck them using fossil fuels 200 miles and lay them on grazing land. Okay, $1.4 billion, 20-year debt for this system. So now let's review the system. Here's how it used to work 10 years ago. We had a combined sewer system which would get a variety of scale of stormwater surges during our plentiful rain all winter. 50 times a year we would get a CSO event into the river, which is what the EPA had a problem with, and they said, you've got to solve that. So we created the big pipe. This big pipe is as much as 22 feet in diameter. It isn't really a pipe. It's really an underground reservoir masquerading as a pipe that feeds sanitary sewage at a controlled rate to the wastewater treatment plant. And here's the kicker. It still overflows 4 times a year. And that's legal. And we designed it 20 years ago for $1.4 billion to still legally overflow into the river 4 times a year. Is that the way you want your public's money spent? Is this completely nuts? It makes me completely crazy. So, which is why we created this slide. We haven't been paid to do this. Our firm created this slide deck because we just elected a new mayor 2 days ago. He happens to be an infrastructure guy. And I want to show this to him and get him thinking about other ways we might spend $1.4 billion of our leveraged public money. There's the pipe. That's a truck inside the pipe. We've had an 83% rise in water rates, and we're not done. We expect another 50% in the next 5 years. I don't think things are that different up here in Seattle. I don't know the numbers, but I think all of our systems use the same basic structure. So now let's imagine how we might do it different. If I gave us all $1.4 billion today, and we were looking out 20 or 30 years, what do we want to do? Let's go down and look at that new South Waterfront District. Those are the buildings that are built right now. These are the ones that are imagined to be built. This is today's existing infrastructure. I will now call that yesterday's infrastructure. Potable water in, sanitary sewer out, with some stormwater systems in it. Now, Portland has been very progressive on getting a lot of stormwater mitigation, which is really going to help some of this. They've had a Gray to Green program that has been creating new infrastructure in the streets so that stormwater is actually getting infiltrated in and not going into the sanitary sewer. We spent $88 million on that, and if we built it the way it was done 10 years ago, we would have spent $144 million, so it's actually saved us $60 million and improved the combined sewer overflow. But it's still not going to be enough, especially with added development that's coming. There are the numbers on that. Really, there's a Gray to Green program, and there's also Tabor to the River program. Both of these has been hugely successful about reorienting the way we spend public infrastructure dollars. And what the reality is infrastructure is becoming sexy, right? We're starting to daylight, literally and figuratively, these things that we've just been pushing away. So now, there's our overflow event. We actually have in the system right at South Waterfront, one of our pipes that overflows into the river is right there. And we're getting some of those 4 overflow events each year are happening right at that pipe, right next to one of the highest rent districts in Portland. So what if we created a purple pipe district? In this district that's under new development, more than 2/3 of it right now is scraped clean. We don't even have all the streets built yet, right? If there was ever a time for us to build new infrastructure, I'm right, we're good on time. Now is the time. So one of the interesting things I've been getting to do on another project is this notion of scalping water. And what's interesting is before I had been made aware of this, I'd always imagined that purple pipe systems, even at district scale, needed to create a whole new network of pipes to redirect the sewage into the systems. Well, it turns out that the sanitary sewer is a really good place to get water to treat. And what's interesting is if you actually scalp it in the right place on these very large pipes, you can have the floaters above it and the sinkers below it, use your imagination, and get cleaner water, which costs less to treat. And yet you're still doing really good things about making that system more resilient. So if we scalp that water, there's at least four different ways to treat that water in a decentralized manner right in that neighborhood. And there's a direct inverse proportion to energy inputs on these water treatment systems and area of land required. So depending on where you are, you could pick any of these systems and still effectively start to create these mitigation mechanisms. There's no right or wrong answer. I can tell you the membrane bioreactor, we have one of these in Portland in one of those high rises in South Waterfront. It uses a lot of energy. We're only going to use membrane bioreactors in places, I think, in the future where we really need to mitigate sewage in some way, and we're willing to pay a big energy penalty. The constructed wetlands and the natural filtration systems like living machines or eco machines are much lower energy. So once you do this, you can really start to see how that, and we're connected right to that big pipe system, right? So we're mitigating the big pipe that we just paid $1.4 billion for right where it makes the biggest impact. Well, what if we did 4 of these? Because we actually have 4 different districts in Portland that are all up for redevelopment right now, all with open land, all that are right next to the big pipe. This could be really interesting as a way for us to spend $1.4 billion. To give you a sense of scale, that's what those systems look like. But if you're wondering if other people have done this, this is the Palo Alto system. Palo Alto and Mountain View teamed up at the scale of 2 cities and created a purple pipe district. It's an 11-inch pressurized purple pipeline that's taking water from the Palo Alto wastewater treatment plant and pushing it back to the cities for reclaimed use. San Jose and Santa Clara, this whole South Bay area, has a much bigger system. And if you want to get a sense of how big those are, that's how big the Palo Alto system is over Portland. And that's how big the San Jose system is over the whole Willamette Valley. Now, I would argue that they may not have done their calculus around what scale do systems optimize. The amount of carbon they're using to actually push this purple water around for a scale this is so big that they may have overshot, in my opinion, without having done any math. But I still think it's interesting, and they've got a much bigger water problem in South Bay than we do. So it may make sense for them. But I want us all to be thinking about these kind of systems as we tear our streets up and imagine tomorrow's infrastructure. We need to do it a different way. So that's it.